and I realized the biggest mistake I've ever made. This might have cost 1 billion children their futures. Reverse transcriptase doesn't only cause cancer. If something is reverse transcribed and alters the DNA of a sperm or an egg, that DNA change, if that sperm or egg survives and turns into a human being, lasts forever. The entire human genome has been poisoned with a gene that has never been in the human genome ever in history. This is going to be a biology lecture, a master's philosophy lecture, and a PhD medical ethics lecture all rolled into one. So please bear with me. So the topic today is mistakes and how easily mistakes can be made if you don't use what the Creator gave you. I can't run very fast, but however fast I can run, I will run. And my mind, thanks to the Creator, is reasonably good. And though I'm not anywhere close to the smartest people I've met in my life, I can still hold my own. And there was one day in November when I didn't use what the Creator gave me. And what ended up resulting is a big mistake. This is why this message is coming to you now, 4 months before it should have come to you. So on November 3rd, in front of Vancouver City Hall, I did a speech about the risks of cancer with children getting this injection. And the 3 mechanisms for cancer I listed was molecular mimicry. If a child's body is producing spike proteins, it won't be able to recognize cancer cells as well. The other one was interference with normal child proteins that every cell makes. Cell proteins that every cell, when it's healthy, those proteins prevent cancer, they prevent mutagenesis and DNA damage. The third mechanism I talked about was reverse transcriptase. And that's the enzyme that's in some cells of the body that can take anything that's mRNA and change it into DNA. So a couple weeks after that speech, I got somewhat famous. And I ended up on a Zoom call with one very famous cell biologist and geneticist who is a big part of the truth movement. And I mentioned the reverse transcriptase issue. And he said, "Oh, don't worry about reverse transcriptase. That's not a significant problem." Now, because I'm an emergency doctor, and the last time I actually studied cell biology was over 20 years ago, in the 1990s, in undergraduate, I thought, well, here's this person who spent his career being a cell biologist and a geneticist and doing experiments. So he probably knows what he's talking about. And then I made my mistake. I turned my brain off. And I didn't think about reverse transcriptase again until about a week ago. And what popped up was one of the articles I was reading was supposedly a leak from a Moderna production line engineer and one of his colleagues. And what he leaked out onto 4chan, which is the most conspiratorial of all conspiratorial websites, was that he was a production line engineer and manager, and on the Moderna production line in December of 2020, this is when the first vaccines were being rolled out, he noticed something very unusual. There were manual add ingredients. And that's very out of the ordinary for a vaccine that they're trying to make millions of doses for. If they're making millions of doses of something, they dump the ingredients into the machine, go home, have a coffee, come back the next day, collect the pre-filled vials. But unlike any other vaccine or production line that he was involved with, the Moderna vaccines had manually added ingredients that no one knew about. So he looked into it. One of the supposed ingredients he alleged on this 4chan post was a mRNA for a protein called cytochrome P19A. And there was another one whose acronym I actually don't remember right now. But what was significant is these are two proteins that are involved in ovaries, in having ovaries be able to ovulate and develop successful eggs. People who have mutated versions of these proteins, they have premature ovarian failure. They can't have kids. They don't ovulate. And any eggs that they do ovulate can't turn into embryos. And I thought to myself, this is like pure evil. Like, why would they be deliberately putting, on top of spike protein genes into their vaccines, now they're putting infertility genes? And I felt enraged. But there was something that David Martin said in one of his lectures that still sticks with me. He's like, and he said basically to the effect, if you withhold judgment, you will be able to see more clearly what's going on. So I put that rage in a bottle, and I looked clearly at what was going on again. You had 3 mRNAs, according to this Moderna engineer, in the injections. A spike protein and 2 proteins for mutated versions of ovarian proteins. And one of the other ingredients that this production engineer said was going in it was something that I had never known even existed. And that's for a reverse transcriptase stimulator. Now, back in the 90s when I was learning cell biology, I learned about reverse transcriptase. And whenever they find a new protein or something that it does, the first thing that gets developed is an inhibitor, how to turn off that protein, even if it's present. Well, 20 years later with progress, they found the opposite of an inhibitor. They found an activator. And they were putting that in the Moderna injections, according to this production engineer. So I thought to myself, why on God's earth would they put a reverse transcriptase stimulator into the injections unless they intentionally wanted all the mRNAs in their injections to be permanently integrated into the DNA? That's the spike protein and 2 proteins to inhibit successful, healthy ovaries from doing their job. There was another study. It came out about the summertime of 2021. That was a leaked study from Japan. You don't have to read Japanese to understand the study, because the tables are in English, and so are the pictures. There's 3 organs that are targeted by the lipid nanoparticle. And this is a lipid nanoparticle that every single one of us paid to create, because this was made at UBC. It was researched and developed at UBC. First, the lipid nanoparticle targets the spleen, then the liver, and then ovaries. Those were the 3 organs that the lipid nanoparticles ended up in the highest concentrations when they looked at the rats after 48 hours. 48 hours after the injection, liver, spleen, and ovary. Now, you can't tell me that's a coincidence. 2 inhibitors of ovulation and a lipid nanoparticle that's designed to carry that mRNA to the ovaries? So then I turned my brain on again, and I thought back to what I was talking about in November, and I realized the biggest mistake I've ever made. This might have cost 1 billion children their futures. Reverse transcriptase doesn't only cause cancer. If something is reverse transcribed and alters the DNA of a sperm or an egg, that DNA change, if that sperm or egg survives and turns into a human being, lasts forever. The entire human genome has been poisoned with a gene that has never been in the human genome ever in history. About 5 billion people out of 7 billion people on this planet have been injected. About 2.5 billion of them are women. About 1.25 billion, so half of that, are women of childbearing age. That means they can have children. There's 1.25 billion women out there that are capable of having children with a genetic alteration. The genetic alteration we know about is the spike protein, and then maybe these two other mRNA sequences that were inserted into the Moderna injections. I do not know if Pfizer did the same thing. Now, if that spike protein gets put into a transcribed region of the DNA, and a transcribed region of the DNA is the part of the DNA that's in everyone's body that's active, that's making proteins. The part of the DNA that's being used to make fingernails, hair, proteins for my brain to keep thinking, digestion proteins. Those are reading frames, they call it, because the body reads the DNA and makes proteins based on what it read. There's something else in the DNA called a non-reading frame. Those are parts of the DNA that are silent, that are not transcribed. And the spike protein appears to be so toxic that if an embryo ever had a spike protein gene, that spike protein DNA reverse transcribed from spike protein mRNA, that embryo would probably die because it's making spike proteins instead of new fingers, new arms, new legs, new feet. However, if that spike protein gene ends up in a non-reading frame, that embryo has a good chance of growing up to be a perfectly healthy baby, a perfectly healthy child, a perfectly healthy adult, because that spike protein DNA is hidden in an inactive part of the DNA. But that doesn't mean that we're all clear, because every generation, when a new embryo is made, there's something called recombination, where the genes from mothers and the genes of fathers are mixed together. And when recombination happens, genes that were previously inactive can get reactivated. So now all of a sudden, even though you had a healthy child who grew up into a healthy adult, who's able to have kids, the grandkids are going to be suffering from spike protein problems because their DNA has been tainted because of what happened here in the past 2 years. This has never been done in human history that we know about before. That a genetic toxin has been put into the entire human genome. A genetic toxin that is capable of hiding and skipping generations. This is what has been done to us. I could have realized this in November if I had kept thinking about reverse transcriptase, if I didn't listen to that expert who I thought knew more than me. So what can we learn from this mistake? No matter what your abilities are, no matter what your inabilities are, please use what the Creator gave you to its fullest. Don't let anybody, expert or non-expert, fool you into not using what you're capable of doing. I should have come up with this message in November, but it's better late than never. So I really want everyone to share this as far and wide as possible. So the philosophical part of this lecture is actually very short. It's about sin, as in the archery definition of sin, that is, being a miss of the target, versus justice. Justice, in the biggest sense, is taking the body that you've been given, and doing the best you can. If you can't run very fast, find something else that you can achieve. Because to do anything less than what you're fully capable of doing is a miss. It's not doing honor to what the Creator's given you. And sometimes when you do sin, when you make a miss, you don't use what you've been given. Mistakes happen. And that's what happened with me. I wish this message had come out 4 months ago. But the other aspect of this, the medical ethics lecture, is what do we do with all those people? Because after getting an injection, my suspicion is it's going to be incredibly difficult for any woman of childbearing age who got this injection to get pregnant in the first place. And if by some miracle someone who got the injection manages to have a child, what are you going to do about that? Are we going to tell that child, nope, your mom got a genetic injection. You might be a silent carrier of a genetic experiment created by Pfizer. We can't let you have children, otherwise this genetic poison created by the pharmaceutical industry will continue to plague the entire human species for the rest of eternity. Can we say that to a child? I don't think I have the heart to. But then what's the question? What's the alternative? That we have this genetically evil product that's been placed into human beings, into the entire human species, through deceit. Do we have that for the rest of eternity? I don't know. My hope is that at some point, science and technology might be able to pick all those genetic contaminants, all those spike protein DNAs out of someone's body. But according to the science and genetics I've learned, that's a near impossible task. Because if someone grows into a successful human being from an embryo that has a silent insertion of spike protein DNA, every cell in their body also has that hidden segment of spike protein DNA. And pulling that out of every cell of someone's body, that's not a technology that I'm aware of. So what can we do? Do we commit another sin and then tell that child who's survived by some miracle that they can't have children of their own? Or do we try and find some other alternative? I don't know. But I'll continue to think about it. So thank you for your attention.
I write vaccine exemptions for cancer. Anyone in your family has a history of cancer, I'll write you in a vaccine exemption. Nobody knows how much cancer this new injection will cause, because it takes 20 years to find out. Any new drug, any new therapy, it takes 20 years to find out how much cancer it will cause. And then, I know there's some pseudoscientists who claim they know the science, who will say, well, I can't prove that it doesn't cause cancer. But let me talk to you about theoretical science, because I did microbiology and physiology at McGill. So, if any of you are listening, all these pseudoscientists who think this vaccine is safe, let me educate you on microbiology and cell biology. So in the human genome, there are retrotransposons, and retrotransposons contain endogenous reverse transcriptase. That means anything that's mRNA or RNA, if it gets inside one of your cells, it's just a matter of luck whether or not that cell reverse transcribes that mRNA back into DNA. I will repeat, every cell in the body has retrotransposons. Every retrotransposon encodes a protein called reverse transcriptase. This is not the reverse transcriptase that's a part of HIV. This is human reverse transcriptase. So anyone who tells you that mRNA cannot change your DNA is absolutely wrong. So the worst part of this is human endogenous reverse transcriptase is most active during embryogenesis, when you're still a fetus. And then it gradually decreases in activity as your development through embryogenesis, birth, infancy, childhood, teenage years. So the people most at risk of DNA changes from an mRNA vaccine are people who are still developing. Then that's children. Children are most at risk for genetic DNA changes from an mRNA vaccine, because children have more endogenous human reverse transcriptase activity than fully grown adults, because they're still growing. The other mechanism of cancer that can be caused, especially when you give children an mRNA vaccine, is immune lack of specificity. Because this mRNA vaccine is telling cells to produce a non-human protein, the spike protein. Why on earth are you giving children whose immune systems are still developing and learning to tell the difference between good cells in the body and bad cells in the body? Why are you telling the cells inside a child's body to produce a non-human protein? And what that will do from a basic immunology point of view, and I am really, really upset at the number of doctors and immunologist specialists who should know what I'm talking about, who are not speaking up. I have a message for those immunologists and pediatric specialists. You better listen and you better remember all the stuff you learned in medical school, because this is why you were taught that. During development, during childhood, the body's immune system has to differentiate between normal cells that are supposed to be present in the body and abnormal cells. If you give the child's body, the cells in that child's body, an abnormal protein and tell those cells to start manufacturing toxic, non-human spike proteins, then there's a good chance that that child's immune system, which is still developing, might say, oh, there's nothing wrong with the body's own cells producing non-human proteins. And so what that will do is 10 years, 20 years, maybe even 30 years later, when eventually through living, sometimes hard work, stress, being exposed to chemicals, when one of those child's cells mutates, and what the immune system should do is recognize the mutated cells that hasn't had a healthy diet, or maybe that cell ate too much McDonald's or something, it should eliminate that cell because it's not producing normal proteins. But if 20 years earlier that child got a spike protein vaccination, that immune system might not be able to recognize the cancerous cell anymore, because that immune system got used to seeing normal cells produce abnormal proteins. So that increases the risk of cancer. So now we're at two reasons why mRNA injections can cause cancer, especially when given to children. One is retrotransposons and reverse transcriptase. The second is immune lack of specificity. Just when a child's immune system should be learning how to make the fine differentiation between cancerous and non-cancerous, you're poisoning that child's immune system with an abnormal, non-human spike protein. But wait, there's a third reason why these injections might cause cancer, especially in children. Children's bodies, the cells in their bodies, should only be making proteins for growth and regular daily cell activities. So when you give cells of the body instructions to produce abnormal proteins, those cells are not producing the normal growth proteins and normal daily activity proteins. One of the most important cells in the body for both adults and children is a class of proteins called heat shock proteins. If you drink too much alcohol, don't get enough sleep, too cold, too hot, exposed to toxic substances, the cells of the body create heat shock proteins, and that enables the cell to survive chemicals, heat stress, toxic stresses. If the cells of your body are busy producing spike proteins instead of heat shock proteins, which also have anti-cancer properties, they prevent DNA damage. If the cells are busy producing spike proteins, they're not producing the cell's own proteins that the cell uses to protect itself against toxins, stress, and DNA damage. So that's a third reason why spike proteins will increase your chances of cancer. If you don't think there's evidence for out there already for this, one of the advisories when Russia released its own coronavirus vaccine was anyone who took the vaccine should not drink alcohol for 2 weeks. And that's a big problem, because that means whatever was in their coronavirus vaccine caused enough metabolic stress that if someone drank alcohol within 2 weeks of their vaccine, they would be causing serious damage to their bodies. And that's only in 2 weeks. We're not even looking at 20 years yet. So the biggest possible crime I can imagine right now, here today, is trying to give this mRNA injection to children. There's 3 molecular and cellular biology reasons not to. And every single one of those 3 reasons increases the chances of cancer.